three jokingly called types of flavors, the electron, neutrino, the muon and tau, which not yet have their operating understood by physical science, but in my view correspond to the momentum of the mentioned principles, with vector addition corresponding to the transcendent function, a principle that cannot be caused by any other to be himself, because of his own. I think that physical science should also take into consideration the possible existence of a fourth type of neutrino, called the sterile neutrino, which would give more meaning to the dynamics of principles, because for me the understanding of how this could only be given by the presence of the fourth principle, that for which man is destined, that is, an equivalent principle to man's existence purpose. Briefly, porting to a two-dimensional graph, we can understand the c-axis, consciousness, and correspond to a pressure of interpretation, and the shaft I, unconscious, as corresponding to a host of the originating images. If every thought carries an affection, as Nietzsche wrote, so every time there is an effort to think this thought will be provided with a composed image of affective density. Let us look to the realization that these axes represent an initial conflict of the ego, as corresponds to a first step of the process of individuation. The ego. The ego is a given compound, first formed by a general perception of our body and existence, and following the records of our memory. We all have a particular idea we have already existed, that is, of our time in past lives. All we accumulated along series of memories. These two factors are the main components of the ego, which enable us to consider it as a complex of physic facts. The force of attraction of this complex is dominant as a magnet. It is he who draws the unconscious contents, that obscure region about which nothing is known. It also calls itself the outside impressions that become aware of their contact. If there is no such contact, such feelings remain unconscious. The ego is the center of our attention and our desires, and the essential core of consciousness. The art of consciously guide the psyche to the authentic experience, i.e. religious experience, suggests an accurate observance of coming from the unconscious images. However, for such images can reach the consciousness of the most reliable as possible, it is necessary that the ego, personality potential of the unit that meditates internal and external world, is in full compliance with them. Not just the existence of an ego that makes dialogue between consciousness and the unconscious, but also an ego that, in continuous self-knowledge, ongoing discovery of selfhood can be the only vehicle of images to be originating. Thus, the dialogue between the unconscious and consciousness would give much for an imagistic flow than by analytical interpretation held by the intellect. Conduct based on this compliance provides the experience of religia, careful observation of yourself, in a more ontological sense than the religiare, rewire, together, make the join. However, the task of returning the eyes to its process, when the contemporary would stimulate the sale of consumer society, and where the evils of that are no more than a set of own evils, lies too troublesome for individuals immersed in this constituency. I often say that not guided by values, beliefs and conventions is an act of courage, is a say yes to life, Nietzschean. But as the soul is religious, naturaliter, that is, it has by its very nature a reconnection function with its computer center, the man fits this experience religia, collect, understand, revisit, reread. He may deny the religious experience. However, this no will also be driven by their desire to self-realization and, given the overwhelming power of the unconscious, nothing would be left to be said for it. His will never override the power of the self. The ego-self axis is initially necessary to have the ego to move through the levels of consciousness, as he himself constituted as a transition vehicle to the self. Here arises, however, an obstacle.